BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Here we are, right by this bullet hole. Rachel was standing in front of a metal map by the side of a steep forest track. Someone had obviously been using the map for target practice. Rachel extended a finger, tracing our path up to this point. I could already see the headline, "Husband and wife found dead in Norwegian wood. British couple die in shooting incident." There was, I noticed, more than one hole in the map. If I were ever going to read all of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I told myself, Norway would be the place to do it. The landscape had a slumbering malevolence. Farms, houses and villages seemed to huddle together for protection along the edge of open stretches of sky, water and rock. Even in the deepest thicket you felt exposed. I mean, anything could happen here. The filtered forest twilight suited the apprehension I'd felt when approaching Nietzsche's most notorious book for the first time. Whether you're planning to make Nietzsche your summer reading, as I've done for many years, or simply want to become better acquainted with his work, do not begin with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a rookie mistake. Even an inveterate and unrepentant poser like me knows better than that. Rachel had given me a copy of the book many years before, but I'd left it gathering dust on the shelf until I'd read and become better acquainted with a few more of Nietzsche's works. I was glad that I'd set it aside until I came here. Norway offered the right backdrop against which to read this grimly ecstatic, provocatively messianic work. I'd started Zarathustra while reclining on an old wooden jetty, listening to the echo of oars across an otherwise silent fjord, noticing its deep reflections and shadows as the distant ferries came and went. Each morning of our holiday, Rachel and I had started our day by swimming together in the round blue pool a short walk from our hotel, watching the sunlight stretching itself across the hills and mountains that surrounded us. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is Nietzsche's most isolated and isolating work. It was written after a clumsy attempt at a love affair had left him estranged not only from two of his closest friends, but also his immediate family. The groundswell of pain he captures in Zarathustra started to make sense to me when set against these rough grey crags and dark swathes of forest. Nietzsche had struggled with severe bouts of illness for most of his adult life and was able to joke about the amount of suffering he encountered on an everyday basis. "Only great pain," he once wrote, "is the liberator of the spirit," adding that he doubted whether it made the human spirit any better, only deeper. I pressed on with my copy of Zarathustra, reading sections at a time, resting against a large slab of granite on the edge of a stark, sunlit quarry, at an isolated railhead, waiting for the last train back to our village, and once, in the shadow of an old ruined chateau above an imposing shoulder of rock covered in wild brush and shale. What emerged was an edifice built upon Nietzsche's misdirected anger, humiliation and disappointment following his failed attempt to force a romantic relationship upon a valued female friend. Every well-crafted sentence in Thus Spoke Zarathustra can be read as a subtle act of revenge on those whom Nietzsche believed had abandoned or betrayed him. Any writer with an inner life to call their own will understand the desire to pay back every slight, stumble and embarrassment through the strict control of language. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche sharpened his feelings and his writing style upon Luther's translation of the Bible, the high point of early German literature. The effect is both poetic and austere. A wounded sense of formality pervades Nietzsche's text, as if he were holding himself tightly in check. Sentences have a dated habit of starting with either an adjective or with archaic interjections such as verily. Zarathustra, the book's central character, spends most of his time in the solitude of his hermit's cave, and just about everyone he meets seems to address him from several yards away. Out of all Nietzsche's literary works, Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the most singularly lacking in intimacy. For me, it's also the book in which Nietzsche makes the greatest effort to conceal himself. This wasn't the Nietzsche I'd grown used to reading. the Nietzsche who explores a line of thought through daring literary experiment and close psychological observation. You wanted to be alone with that Nietzsche, even when you found yourself disagreeing with him. When that Nietzsche writes, he speaks directly to you. His tone is often intimate and informal, as if he were taking you into his confidence. His restless intellectual probing, often expressed in short, precisely phrased aphorisms, is spread before you like a landscape upon the page. This was the Nietzsche I'd first encountered one blazing hot summer many years before. I'd taken a cheap paperback edition of his book, The Gay Science, with me on a long trip around the Greek islands. It marked my first attempt at reading Nietzsche while on holiday. I still have that battered old copy of The Gay Science, stained yellow with sunlight and travel, and I continue to read it with the greatest affection. The bookmark I'd used was a leaf from the ancient tree where Hippocrates, the founder of Western medical practice, is said to have taught over 2,000 years ago. To this day, the leaf remains pressed between the book's pages, brittle and dry with age. It was Nietzsche's The Gay Science that first introduced me to the numbered aphorism as a basic component of writing. I frequently use the form in my own work out of deference to its early influence. I don't think I did so well reading Nietzsche that particular summer. I now see that while I was trying to make sense of The Gay Science, I was walking over a crevasse without realising it. The ground only started to open up beneath me when I brought my copy of Zarathustra to Norway. Here was a different Nietzsche from the one I'd come to know. In Zarathustra, he declaims and expounds, writing at rather than for the reader, laying out his big ideas in antique German. I find the main problem with Nietzsche's big ideas is that they tend to get in the way of what he is thinking. Like a bullet hole in a metal map in the middle of a dark forest, they distort your understanding of the terrain. It's sometimes difficult to follow a path round Nietzsche's big ideas, even though they often seem so closely connected to the landscape. There is, for example, Nietzsche's mighty pyramidal block of stone, the one he describes standing by a lake in Switzerland. It was here, Nietzsche claims, that he first came upon the notion of eternal recurrence. So far as big ideas go, this one's pretty monolithic. Eternal recurrence, Nietzsche would later declare, was the insight that led directly to the writing of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So fervent was Nietzsche about the idea of eternal recurrence that he'd already expounded upon it in The Gay Science. Flashes of Greek sunlight illuminated the green waters of the Norwegian fjords, where Rachel and I rode sleepy ferries from one harbour to another through dark, cavernous channels. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche imagines an intense encounter with a demon that steals into what the German philosopher describes as his loneliest loneliness. What if, the demon asks Nietzsche, your life up to this moment were to be repeated over and over again without the slightest change, right up to my speaking to you now? Would my words throw you into the darkest despair, or would you embrace them as divine? The Norwegian landscape, so sombre and raw even in the height of summer, leaned in over the demon's proposition, more threatening and immovable than any pyramidal rock by the side of some Swiss lake. Rachel and I stood together on a jetty, watching our ferry disappear from view, then settled down to wait for the local bus to take us back to our hotel. What I like about Norway is the sky, Rachel said quietly, shading her eyes. That big sky. I suddenly felt very glad that she was there with me. Nietzsche claimed that he could be seen dancing on his mountain walks while composing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But who was actually there to see him dance? You know you're really alone and in pain when your only company is a demon. Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence has isolation at its core. Think about it for a moment. You're not only trapped forever in your own personal life up to that point, condemned to repeat it endlessly without the slightest chance of improvement or change, but so is the rest of the entire universe as you've experienced it so far. Everything will be repeated without end, just as it always has been and always will be. No wonder the subtitle Nietzsche gave to his Zarathustra was A Book for Everyone and No One. a phrase that remains the eloquent summation of a lonely man's horizons. Our local bus approached the jetty and slowed to a stop. Two of the drunkest people I've ever seen in my entire life came tumbling out and started staggering across the harbour car park, where one of them lay down in an empty bay. To get that loaded by the middle of the afternoon seemed to me to be quite an achievement, especially in Norway, where alcohol is priced so prohibitively high. Did you ever say yes to a single joy? Zarathustra asks a group of visitors to his lonely cave. Then you said yes to all woe as well. By virtue of being endlessly repeated, everything is inseparably entwined and chained together, from the sublime beauty of this Norwegian fjord to the two blathering drunks rolling around in the car park. According to Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, you cannot experience the one thing without accepting every other thing that happens as well. The wide, pale Norwegian sky was as inevitable to me as the stumbling drunks splayed out below it. To say yes under such circumstances, Nietzsche argues, is the supreme affirmation of life. This is the divine gift offered by his demon in the gay science. Are you prepared to accept it? Eternal recurrence has to include our most clinging moments of immaturity, clumsiness and ignorance, our feelings of pain, humiliation and rejection, because in these lie the origins of our future development. It cannot be any other way. Nietzsche's own pain and humiliation had led to the concept of eternal recurrence. And now I found Nietzsche's big idea cutting into my life in a way I had not expected. One afternoon, Rachel and I hiked up to a lonely poet's cabin overlooking the fjord. A guide told us that from its windows you could look out on a small, bare scrap of an island in the middle of the fjord's blue waters. Criminals sentenced to death would be rowed out to this spot in the hour before dawn, and there they would be executed, by strangulation as I recall. The entire fjord, encircled by the unadorned grey shapes of mountains, formed a natural theatre for such scenes. For all its stiff, antiquated language, Thus Spoke Zarathustra remains Nietzsche's most poetical work, filled with echoes and repetitions, themes and motifs. But it has a grim sense of acceptance at its heart. It's a book that makes complete sense when read against Norway's brooding existential landscape. Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence might well have seemed easier to endure when contemplated by the side of some Swiss lake. But out here, staring down at that forbidding patch of island in the middle of a shining blue fjord, the implications of eternal recurrence became much more serious. Suddenly, nothing seemed more degrading to the human spirit than the urge to cling on to life and happiness. Better, I thought, to say, "It's been a good day," and move on. These moments are all too rare, Nietzsche asserts from the loneliness of his mighty pyramidal rock, but they too shall return. All you have to do is say yes.